I want to tell you a couple stories about corn that I've learned from neighbors and fellow travelers over the years. One has to do with my own experience sharing corn with Hopi children up on the Hopi Indian Reservation in northern Arizona. When I taught in Hopi schools, we did a very interesting experiment where we took hybrid bantam corn, a corn that's grown all over the Midwest, or was, and grew that in something that looks like an ant farm, one of these boxes that schools have to show children how ants make their burrows and move around. And we planted that corn 8 inches deep in the sand from the Hopi sand dunes. And then what we did was plant Hopi corn next to it. And what we found out was that after 6 days, all the Hopi corn had come up through the sand and had deeper roots than the hybrid corn from the Midwest. And that the hybrid corn from the Midwest, after 8 days, had not even come up to the surface of the sand. Well, you might wonder who plants corn 8 inches deep and why. The Hopi do and have for centuries, because in the early parts of May and June when they plant, that's how deep the moisture is before the summer rains come. So if you lost Hopi corn from northern Arizona and northern New Mexico, the blue corn and red corns that we're used to, and tried to replace that with corn from Iowa, it's doubtful that that corn would come up if planted the traditional way, or if it was planted less deeply so that it could come up, it would probably not survive the drought. So the whole point is that corn is not just one plant. Just like every human is different, corn is this wonderful diversity of locally adapted varieties, just like each people on the planet have adapted their life ways to different conditions. That's true with corn as well. Well, what happens when you take corn out of its local environment? I learned when traveling through Italy that although people love corn today, there's a certain amount of fear about eating too much corn there. And that's because when corn was first introduced to Europe, there was a huge population explosion of Europeans, and corn allowed the growth of their population because it was so productive. But that in years when no other crops produced much and people relied over half of their diet on corn, people began to go crazy. They actually went insane. They had horrible sores on their body, and the disease was called pellagra, or rose-colored skin. And it was because the people who introduced corn from Mexico and the southwest United States didn't know that to release all the nutrients in corn, you have to mix it with ash or lye, cal, to be able to soften the husks or the shells of each corn seed to make hominy for pozole or for menudo. And without that processing, the Hopi use bean ash to put in with corn to keep the blue color, but also to soften it. If you don't put in one of those ashy alkali minerals, you don't release the vitamins that are in corn, the niacin in particular, and that makes people crazy. And it wasn't until a Mexican Indian traveled to Spain and Italy and saw that people were growing corn but not processing it in the traditional way that this puzzle was solved. And hundreds of thousands of people were then taught different ways of producing and preparing corn that kept them from having this terrible disease, pellagra, which is now almost non-existent in Europe. The third story is about someone from Latin America who grew up eating corn every day that was expelled from their country during a political skirmish where all artists were asked to leave the country if their art was considered at all political. And so she was forced to move to Europe, and at first lived in parts way up in the mountains where you couldn't grow corn. And then she was asked to give a performance down in southern Italy. And as she drove down there from Switzerland, all of a sudden, she was surrounded by cornfields for the first time in 10 years. And she pulled her car over to the side of the road and, crying, went into the cornfield and just started eating corn right off the plants. Pretty soon, a farmer and his family came out and said, "What are you doing in our cornfield? Are you stealing our corn?" And she spoke enough Italian to tell them why she was eating it. And they ended up giving her a gift of a bushel of fresh green corn to take on with her so she wouldn't feel so lonely. So in this sense, corn is a friend. Corn is part of our cultural memory, and what it makes us feel like gives us part of our identity.
Thank you so much. That was great.
If you knew and had a really good history, or somebody really taught you the history of the Americas and how our people supported your people, the Americans, if that's what they're called now, the revolutionaries during the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. George Washington was your general, and he got supported through funding, and people were supporting the war, supporting the soldiers and so forth in the beginning of the war, but it wasn't going that well, as you all know, that the war wasn't happening exactly the way what they wanted to see it go at first. And his soldiers were hungry, and he was trying to find money to feed his soldiers, George Washington, and he wasn't able to get the money to support his army at a particular time. And he went to some of the Iroquois in the upstate New York, and he began to address some of his concerns. And as some of you probably know, that the Iroquois Confederacy was divided. Some fought for the British and some fought for the colonists. They approached, George Washington approached the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras at this time, and they said that he explained what was happening, what this fight for freedom and all this was about, and they agreed. They said, "Yes, we'll support you, we'll help you." And this was in the middle of winter. It's about sometime in January that both the Oneidas and Tuscaroras, it was the women that controlled the corn, the warehouses of corn in the communities, said, "Yes, we'll support you, so we'll give you corn." They carried it on their backs in the middle of January down to his army and gave them corn. They didn't sell it, they didn't loan it, they gave it to him to support this war in trying to support freedom and democracy, all these wonderful things they gave him. He, in turn, actually it was his wife, Martha, gave the Oneidas a gift in return, and they said that they would never molest them, steal their land, and so forth. But they also gave them this shawl, because it's the women that brought this gift down. So the Oneidas still have the gift. It's in a security box in somewhere in New York State. But it's to me, it's your freedom that you have. This comes from our mother, a gift of corn.
Well, I think I don't think of any as a young girl, but when we do our ceremonies, our dances and stuff, you need a lot of cornmeal because we do a lot of praying during that time, and you know, the old way of making cornmeal is metates and, you know, grinding it on stone. So there's a lot of funny stories of everyone trying to get together to grind this corn when nowadays a lot of people use the grinder, different kind of grinders. Well, I happen to have one of these grinders, so the people will come to me with their corn and say, please make this into cornmeal for me. So for a while there I've been making cornmeal for everybody, but we had a garden festival years ago at Santa Clara, and I brought the grinder down. And it was the biggest hit. Everybody was bringing their garlic, their corn, their everything to grind up into meal. So I think it's pretty funny.
So, I was referring to corn pollen, and this is a corn pollen bag. And in here is pollen from my family's field. And this is what we pray with in the morning and we use during ceremonies. And this is from the top of the stalk. And it's yellow, very sweet. And that's what we give our offerings in the morning. To the morning sun, to Father Sky and Mother Earth. To ask for blessings of wellness and to pray in the beauty way. And this is dry corn. This is again from my family's field. This is something that my family really we really value. After we harvest the corn, we dry it out, and this isn't the corn that we use, but we dry it out like this, and we take each of the corn, we take 2 dry corn cobs, and we grind them together into a basket, and off of the corn cob we get this dry corn, and this makes really good stew. We make with mutton or beef, and we save this corn. This is really valuable, like I said, to the women in my family, because we always have it in the back of our cupboards, so that like when we have family that comes, and it can feed a lot of people, and it's very nutritious and sweet. People of all ages typically really enjoy it, so it's good for the little children, babies up to adults. So this is something that my family always have on hand, and I would say it's pretty rare. People nowadays don't take a lot of time to make this dried corn. When you would find it in a bag like this at the flea market, and it would cost you anywhere from $8 to $10 a bag. And so this is something my family always tries to keep on hand, and we try to make enough of to last for the whole year. That's one of the teachings my grandmother instilled in us, is to make this dry corn so that we would always have something to feed our family.
If someone were to plant this corn, what would you tell them? How to plant it, when to plant it, all of that. What could you tell them to help them?
We usually plant ours by the middle of April. and then don't plant it too close together. And my dad and mom taught us when we were small, but three kernels at a time, by hand. Then now we use a planter. We still do that, Well, we not about a half an inch deep, or between half an inch to about half an inch. Barely, a lot of people they stick corn way in the ground and maybe put about 10 kernels of corn in the ground, and that's what my mom and dad taught me. I didn't have very knowledge about farming, but they taught us, what to do, and I think they carried on from the beginning, I guess.
We dry them out, and there's different ways of preparing steamed corn. Some of them we dig a big old hole in the ground, and then we haul in a truckload of corn, fresh corn, and we dump it all in there. First we build a fire in the ground, and it gets it to a certain temperature. Maybe we'll keep the fire going like all day long, and then by the evening we throw all the corn in there, fill up that hole. We cover it up with boards and just seal it off.
Water.
Yeah, we dump a little bit of water in it for the steam, and then that cooks all night. And then early in the morning we rush out there and we get everybody in the family, runs out there, and we'll be tossing all that corn out of the dirt, and we have to keep it clean though. And then we load it up in the truck. Sometimes we'll, take it down to the flea market and sell it. And everybody, loves the steamed corn, the fresh steamed corn, especially when it's still hot. And that's how we make extra income too. And then some of them that we don't sell, we'll just pull off the leaves like this, and we dry it out. And it'll take a couple of days to dry it out. And then we pull all the corn off of the husk, and that we make steamed corn, the stew out of it. We put a little bit of mutton in it, and we also used to sell steamed corn with mutton during the summertime with rye bread.
Agriculture today is 12,000 years old. It started about 10,000 BC. But farmers knew that they would plant crops out in the field, and they would get larger heads of whatever crop they were producing. And they knew enough that they should save the seed to plant again next year, because their production would increase. Their grains would increase inside. It fed more people. And during that period of time, we became more efficient in food production. So now none of us had to sit around and sit behind the plow. Some of us could go out and be hunters, or be blacksmiths, or run a computer, whatever other thing that we do today. Okay? But as we talk about biotechnology tonight, we're talking about this aspect. The process in which humans intervene in the biological processes of genetic alternation for improvement of that crop. So what are GMOs? That's what you're here to hear about tonight. There's a complete whole category on what GMOs are about. The first one, recombination of DNAs. That means that we take DNAs apart and put them back together again, and that is a GMO. Genetic engineering. The splicing aspect is a GMO. Transgenic modification, bringing a gene from one plant, one animal, one bacteria, one virus, and geneticing it into a plant is a GMO. And gene modification, adjusting that gene a little bit, is a GMO. 71% of the crops that we have today are herbicide tolerant. That means they're tolerant, and it's basically probably to Roundup, soybeans and corn. 29% of the crops that we plant out there are insecticidal crops, resistant to a specific insect. The protein that is made in there is Bacillus thuringiensis. We use it with organic crops to control against insects. 85 million acres in the United States is in GMOs. That's about 1/4% of our acreage. This year, number will increase by about 13%. 55 million acres are planted outside of the United States. One of the things that they can't do is they can't control the location of where that gene goes into. That gene's small, and they kind of throw a dart in there and hope that it's in the right spot. So we have to work with the location of that. That's a problem. Another problem is sometimes as we're putting in genes into the DNA, oftentimes we put in more genes than is necessary, mainly because we can't see what we're working with. What this does is this creates an instability in that plant. And that instability in that plant often causes different problems. Problems like toxins, like plant infertility, reduction in yields. Wow, wait a minute, GMOs are supposed to increase yields. As of this date, GMOs have not increased yields in corn. Okay? Sometimes it affects the thickness of the plant. Sometimes it causes resistance towards insects and other diseases. So we should be worried about that. And it has created new types of viruses that we just don't quite know how to handle. But we're working with it, okay? We're working with it. What happens in the meantime? That's a good question. Since about 60% of the food that you're eating are probably GMO related right now. Hey, your bread should be black, but it's white. Maybe that's one of the things, okay? We don't know, okay? And I'm one of the first to say that we don't know what's happening in this aspect of it. Should we know? Yes, we should know. I agree with that aspect.
So, my family, we're originally from Shiprock, New Mexico. That's where my mother and her family grew up, and originally they're from Red Valley, set up against the mountains in Red Valley, Arizona, and it's just right outside of Shiprock, and that's where we have a lot of our family land and our farm and fields. And we also have some plots, farming land in Shiprock. So I grew up around in that region when I was really young. My grandmother would take me out early in the morning, like at the crack of dawn, and that always has been typical of my grandmother. And my early upbringing was to always wake up at the crack of dawn, and we would wake up and pray to the morning sun coming up in the east horizon and pray with corn pollen to give our offerings for the day and to ask for blessings for wellness and wellness with our family and wellness and health, and that we will walk in beauty and pray to the four directions, that we will be, that our family will be taken care of, and pray that everybody around us and friends and other people will also be well taken care of also. Yeah, this book is Songs of Shiprock Fair, and it's written by Lucy Tapahanso, and it illustrated by Anthony Chi Emerson. And this is a book about the Shiprock Fair that happens annually in Shiprock in October. And like I said, the local people in the community do a lot of preparations for this fair. And at the fair they have a agriculture exhibit, and that's where they show like the healthiest stocks and the largest stocks. They show corn, the different varieties of corn, and they give awards out for this. And then also they have a market where they sell the corn and the other vegetables that are grown, melons. And so this is a really nice book about the time of harvest and what goes on during the Shiprock Fair.